This week, Brian Ventura and Ted Gary join us to talk about the CIS Controls, specifically the first 5. In enterprise security news, everyone gets a printer. Ixia has some news. Who's afraid of cloud app management? 5 tips to maximize your IT security training. McAfee Labs reports on the evolution of evasion techniques, and so much more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. The teleprompter now has artificial intelligence, Doug, and updates itself. It's awesome. This week, and talk about them as it relates to enterprise security. You're going to do great.
I think that people think that you and I talk like every day at night. You know, It's like, hey, what are you doing? It's kind of a bit of an exhausting week. And I think that we noticed that a little bit in the stories for this week as well.
LogRhythm's Netmon Freemium delivers real-time network visibility to quickly identify emerging threats in your IT environment. Netmon Freemium is a free commercial-grade network forensics and traffic analytics solution. You can use Netmon Freemium's powerful capabilities to search against all observed network traffic, identify abnormal traffic patterns and application usage, and quickly analyze full packet captures. Take the first step towards real-time network visibility. Visit logRhythm.com/freemium to learn more and download it today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. IT Pro TV, an easy, entertaining approach to online IT training. Stream over 2,000 hours of up-to-date, high-quality video content live and on demand. Premium annual memberships include all video content as well as access to virtual labs and the Q&A forums. You'd pay $85.70 a month or $857 per year, but we have a special offer for our listeners. For a free 7-day trial and 30% off the lifetime of your active subscription, visit itpro.tv/enterprise security and use the code ES30. Welcome, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode 50. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, and I'm joined by some familiar faces from some of our other shows on the Security Weekly network. I am very happy to say that John Strand is here in a car somewhere in an undisclosed location. John, welcome. And John is muted. That's okay. We'll get you back, John. The first time.
Here.
Oh, hey, John. What's going on? How are you?
Just a train wreck. That's all. All good. Good.
So, yep, same as always. That's good. Love you, John. So, for the first time on Enterprise Security Weekly, we'd like to welcome Mr. Larry Pesce. Larry, welcome.
Yay! There goes my cherry.
Yes, there it goes. Wonderful to have you on this show. I'm very excited. Also, Joff Thayer is here as well. Joff, welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's good to be here.
Yes. I'll introduce our guest in just a moment. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. The first B-Sides in Uganda, B-Sides Kampala, is being held October 14th through the 15th. The CFP is open until July 15th. They're looking for talks on web and network application security, innovative attack and defense strategies, malware analysis, biometrics, evolutionary computing, robotics. Bonus if you bring your own robot, bsideskampala.com to submit your CFP today. Also, come check out Wild West Hackin' Fest. That's right, put on by Black Hills Information Security. Join us on October 27th and 28th for hands-on hacking talks by myself, Larry Pesce, Joff Thayer, and more. How about that? Visit us on the web at wildwesthackinfest.com, HACKIN-fest.com.
And doesn't John look so great on that horse?
He does. He's awesome.
Awesome.
It's very nice.
So want to fire Sierra.
No, we love it. We think it's great. Speaking of websites and stuff, the securityweekly.com recently got a facelift and it is an all brand new website. So please check it out at securityweekly.com. It was I lost even more hair, if that was even possible. It was quite the experience cutting over to a new website. It was all.
So that's good.
What's that, John?
I was gonna say, but now you know Docker, so that's good.
I have not put it in Docker yet. It was a feat, amazing feat. It was all good until I cut it live, and then I was like, wow, there's all kinds of issues for me to fix now. So it's how it goes. Maybe we'll do Docker on those in the future. We'll see. I'd like to introduce our special guests for this segment, Brian Ventura, SANS Instructor, and Ted Gary, who's a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Tenable. Welcome, guys. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
So, Ted, you were telling us before the show that you both are kind of collaborating on a project that focuses on what are now the CIS controls, which were formerly the security ascent. What was? Can you explain the naming to us?
Yeah, kind of. There's a long story there. It started out, most people knew it as the SANS Top 20, and then it went through a couple of evolutions. And up until a few months ago, it was called the CIS Critical Security Controls. Just recently, CIS renamed them the CIS Controls, and I'm still trying to reprogram my brain. I think Brian is too.
Same with me, yes.
And Tenable did a project with the Center for Internet Security back in November of last year, where we surveyed over 300 organizations to understand their adoption of the first 5 of the CIS controls. Those are called the foundational cyber hygiene controls, because we wanted to know, are people using these things out in the industry? And we found that not so much, at least not as much as they should be. In fact, on average, most organizations have only implemented about half of those first 5 controls, which is pretty concerning. So Tenable's done several things around that. We've done a lot of webcasts and getting lots of interest in it. But and Brian's been really our expert speaker because he knows so much about the controls. So it's up to you, Paul, but maybe we should have Brian just kind of outline those first 5 controls.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. Go ahead, Brian.
Great. Yeah. So the CIS controls, the first 5, are talking about inventory, kind of basics. So we're going to inventory all of our systems that are connected to our networks. And there we're talking about not only those PCs, laptops, desktops, servers, but also network equipment, cameras, and any other kind of IoT type of things. Then we're going to inventory for the second control, the software that is running on all of those devices. And the point of doing these things is to limit the number of machines on our network, make sure they're all authorized to be on our network, and then also the software that's running on them is authorized to be in our environment. Once we've inventoried what we have and limited our exposure, then we can start doing fun things like having a secure configuration. So the third control is a secure configuration on all those devices, both the hardware and the software. And we follow that up with our vulnerability scanning and patching, which is a huge problem and can resolve a lot of problems in our organizations if we can identify where we need to be patched and then do those patches. And then the last one in the 5 is to limit the use of administrative access. So on our laptops, desktops, we want to make sure that people are running as normal users, but also on our servers and any other place that they use the most limiting access that they can have for that, and that'll help protect us from escalation and different kinds of problems. So in a nutshell, those are the first 5. They're considered the foundational controls and sometimes called cyber hygiene, foundational cyber hygiene, trying to get to the idea that this is like washing your hands in a hospital. It protects lives, even though it's something simple that you're doing. It's not a complex solution. Here we're listing out 5 things that, if we do them well, could reduce up to 85% of the breaches that have happened in the past.
I want to turn it over to our other panel, who are all penetration testers today. Does this jive with some of the things you see organizations not doing today?
I'll take a quick stab at that. Sorry, John, I'm going to cut you off because I can. But and absolutely, one of the things that I find as a penetration tester, and we definitely talk about the two first controls there, the inventory. There are so few places that I go into that can give me an accurate inventory of their desktops, their servers, their software in any given point. And those that can, they're far from complete. And the part that starts to scare me is, we start seeing the influx of IoT in enterprise, and I think that's going to become an even harder problem for inventory for something like that.
John?
And yeah, let me know if my audio is too choppy and I'll shut up. But whenever we set out to create the critical controls years ago, originally it was Eric Cole, Ed Scotus, James Taralla predominantly, and now it's pretty much ran completely by James Taralla and Kelly Taralla. That idea, those 5 foundations, everything that the 20 critical controls originally revolved around was around things that actually applied to real threats and real risks. And those kind of like the opening hygiene controls were basically saying if we could take, the goal was 75%. If we could take 75% of the exploitable situations that we encounter as testers off the table, what would be the easiest things for people to do? And that's basically what came up with the first 5. As the stuff was being passed around by Alan Poller at SANS and getting everyone's input on it. So it was intentionally set up that way, but, kind of springboarding off of what Larry said, and I'll kind of throw this to Joff too. Guys, are we seeing people get better over the past 5-6 years? I mean, yeah, we can say that it's not as good as it should be with the survey that Tenable did, but are we actually seeing improvement over time? I think that that's a different question.
Well, I'd like to chime in. I do see some improvement with a subset of customers, and it's usually those that are more able to execute. To be honest, the larger ones that are frankly more difficult to pen test, and the ones that I find that are very, very challenging for me in the day-to-day are the ones that truly, if there's anything at all, that truly have their assets under control. The ones that know exactly where their hardware is and they know exactly where their software is, because, especially on that latter point, knowing exactly where your software is usually means that you have inventoried it very precisely and you know exactly what's running in your environment. So, I think there are some that are getting better, but then there's also the challenge of the overwhelmed group, and we have customers like that just cannot seem to get a handle on it, that have a lot of shadow IT growing, that have got even uncontrolled cloud initiatives springing up, and that's still a significant problem. So I see a real mix.
Yeah, how often do you guys go on a pen test and find systems and/or applications that the organization didn't know about?
Often.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly often. And a lot of it does spring out of the shadow IT space and the fact that there are so many services out there that people don't have to go through a central IT department to leverage anymore. So they just go out and shop. So
right.
It's
Brian,
a whole thing, right?
Brian and Ted, why do you think that a lot of organizations struggle with asset management, and what are some tips for people to get better at that?
Great question. I think people are struggling just because it is so easy to plug in an extra device, use your personal device, and download the latest software that you need to do the job. It's typically very easy to do those tasks, and so it's hard to manage centrally through an organization saying we're not going to allow these things. And so what the controls say is first get those inventories, know what's on your network, and then start leveraging some of the technology that is available to limit other devices and other software. So for Control 1, we're talking about using some form of network level authentication to say these devices have like a machine cert so they can be on the network. No other devices are allowed without a certificate. And then same thing with the software. We say here's our authorized list, and it might be long. It might be 500 applications, but these are the only applications that we use. So now we're going to say anything that is not on this list won't run with something like a software whitelisting. And that'll help to protect from those non-targeted attacks for sure. And then many of the targeted attacks, I think it will help with those as well. And then secure configuration, vulnerability assessment, doing those scans and coming and identifying where you do have problems and remediating those is going to also be important. And what I've found when trying to get those inventories is I'll go to our groups and say, hey, do you have an inventory? And they'll say, yes, we have an inventory of all our desktops. And I'll say, great, okay, do you have the servers? And they'll say, well, no, that's a different department. So getting the information is very challenging because different groups manage their areas, and you have to kind of get them to all come together and build it into a centralized repository that is complete.
Ted, it's somewhat of a softball question for you. In today's day and age of containers, virtualization, and cloud applications, how do we get an accurate and continuing asset inventory of our software?
Yeah, well, one is you got to look at the activity on your network. And, obviously Tenable has some capability to do that. Paul, you may not be aware, we've renamed the passive vulnerability scanner to be Nessus Network Monitor, but that'll show you what applications are being used on the internet. And then we also have capability to not only identify containers, but to assess them.
Excellent. So in terms of managing cloud applications, right? I mean, virtualization in containers is one thing. Obviously there's a whole space around CASBs. How does that play into the equation to be able to manage, your applications that are now essentially not even your own, they're running in the cloud? How does that change IT security, and what can people do to start getting in those waters of managing the software as a service?
Excellent question. That does get difficult because when I talk about doing an inventory and then turning on network access control or network level authentication to block things, that's assuming it's a physical device that's in my organization. Now that I'm talking about something that's in the cloud, I can't do network level authentication. It doesn't make sense. So now my inventory, I need to understand where I have contracts, where I have systems, and make sure that the management of those cloud services is handled in a responsible way. So with containers and things like that, we're spinning up and spinning down machines very quickly. The inventory might not be exactly which machine you have, but it will be an inventory of which containers are authorized and are allowed to turn on versus other containers that are in a test mode, and make sure they're in a different network. And then some of the other controls, there's 20 total controls in the CIS controls, do talk about some of those network level things that you can do to limit access for these cloud devices. So you can do segmentation to make sure that your test environment and your production environment aren't in the same network, those kinds of things.
So I'll turn it over to our penetration testers. In terms of network access control, for lack of a better term, I know everyone's trying to get away from the NAC acronym. How often do you discover that on a penetration test, and how often does it slow you down?
So I'll share one. Oh, go ahead, John. I'll let you go first.
Oh, we can toss it back and forth, but
Sure.
Don't often find it, to be honest. More sophisticated customers have gone down that road, but that is only a very, very small percentage in my experience. Those that have traveled that path sometimes don't do it so well. There is, particularly in the NAC space, there's a tendency to make pretty broad exceptions for devices that don't have capabilities to play. Imagine printers, for example, access points for wireless access, things like that. That sometimes they're not secured very well and segmented very well in the network access control space, and so they become attack surfaces that you can certainly get to from an on-premise pen testing perspective. So it's a mixed bag, but I only see the more sophisticated customers actually going down that path all the way, and in some instances very sophisticated. And I've seen full TLS certificate-based authentication on the network out to the client side, which is a very impressive thing. But I think I have maybe one customer that I've ever seen do that.
Yeah. So, Geoff, I'm a little bit different. We're starting to see a lot more of our customers actually having NAC, but I will also agree most of them are probably not deployed to the fullest capability or deployed well. In fact, I can not think of a time when we've encountered NAC in recent memory that we have not been able to bypass NAC. And in fact, in a recent test with one of our customers, our guys ended up in the conference room, got their equipment plugged in as intended, sort of going on the assumed breach model a little bit. And the client contact said, "Hey, I have to run. I have to go to a meeting. I'll be back in an hour." That actually turned into 4. And when he came back in 4, said, "Hey, I probably need you guys get you past NAC and have that port restriction disabled and all this type of stuff." And the answer was actually no. We've already got domain admin, and we're dumping your database.
Well, I was about to make a comment, Larry. It's an interesting vector. If you've got .1x on a network port or wireless, doesn't matter which. It actually becomes a vector for password spraying potentially, because you've got another way to authenticate directly to the network and look for responses, which is kind of fun in its own way. So it can be a plus and a minus. That's why I mentioned the client side TLS certificate stuff, because that's really the way to do things if you're going to do them right. Unfortunately, very few people tend to get to that place.
Brian and Ted, I wanted to ask you in terms of configuration management. I know that everything that we have has a configuration that needs to be managed. One of the ones that I think is most often preyed upon by attackers, both penetration testers and malware and real-world attackers as well, is Active Directory. What advice do you have for people, like when you're going through the class, Brian, and you get to Active Directory? How do you manage the configuration inside of your Windows environment, especially as you're scaling that out to 100,000 plus endpoints?
Yeah, so with the configuration management, we're really talking about coming up with some kind of baseline of all the settings that are available. And when talking about a Microsoft server, there's a lot of settings in there. So we're going to need to have a place to get those. And Microsoft is a source. They'll have their best practices documents that you can look up, and they'll give you best practice recommendations. In addition, the Center for Internet Security, that CIS that we keep saying, the Center for Internet Security does have benchmarks. It's a pay service. It's a nonprofit organization, but they do have benchmarks that are community driven and get updated pretty frequently, and they'll have a lot of settings that they'll recommend for you to turn on. They have a couple different levels, a level 1 and a level 2. The level 1 is your basic systems, and then your level 2 is your very secure environments where you can turn those settings on. But going through Active Directory is definitely very important.
So I'm going to be a bit of a curmudgeon because Jack's not with us, and we're just, one Jack short of being Full Security Weekly. But as far as being curmudgeon-y, 2 things. One, whenever you're talking about Active Directory, I'm really of the belief now that standard Active Directory implementations and security are 2 mutually exclusive concepts. Active Directory by itself, standard vanilla installation, even if you have your group management and everything set up and you're handling your settings, it is an absolute boon to every single pen tester. It becomes a pen tester superhighway. The second thing about configurations, and this is something I probably need to talk to James and Kelly about, but a lot of it's kind of out of our hands now that CIS has taken over, is I have very rarely do I see on the operating system side secure configurations do a dang thing at all to ever stop an attacker. And when we're talking about secure configurations for network devices and switches and things like that, absolutely. But it's so bad. I remember there was a couple of years ago, Richard Batelick was giving a talk or giving a class at Black Hat, and he was using his victim VM image was actually a system with the full DISA implementation and all of the STIGs completely locked down. And he was using that as an example system to basically run malware on. So I'd like to hear from Joff and Larry about this a little bit, but I hate to be the wet blanket on this, but I'm starting to feel more and more like Active Directory standard default configuration is just too easy to break into an organization. There's nothing you can do to stop an attacker that knows what they're doing if you're using Active Directory without some cool things like Javelin networks in play. And then the second thing is configurations. I've never seen a desktop configuration that's been like crap. They had that setting turned on and that stopped us.
Larry,
Okay.
Jeff?
I can't help but agree to some extent. I mean, the Active Directory is just an incredibly useful source of information, right? And that goes to the good side and to the attacker side. Once we start leveraging ADSI queries, we pull out just an incredible wealth of information that is useful to expand our movement in an environment. So that, it definitely assists the attacker. On the desktop side, I recently did a test that the friends that I was working with did. Their desktops built to dysastig, and it was pretty good. Frankly, it slowed me down significantly. I'm not saying there was a golden switch to say, hey, that stopped me from doing everything that I needed to do. But there are certainly ways that you can raise the bar significantly to the point where enough noise is being made when an attacker's trying to move around that it will be noticeable. And that's what really people need to focus on.
Yeah, Jeff, I'll agree. But and I would argue that sure, it raises the bar. That just means us as penetration testers and/or if we're doing quote red team style, that just means we need to raise our level of effort and pull out some different stops and some different tricks. And in most of the cases, all of those work, and are relatively quiet.
I want to turn over to Ted and/or Brian, and I agree with what John, Joff, and Larry are saying. I'll even add, that configuration when it's application specific, when it's network device specific, I think really helps. When you get down to the operating system, I agree it tends to be a lot less effective. So Brian or Ted, do you have a kind of response to that? Putting you on the spot.
Thank you. I like to be on the spot. So I definitely agree that there are ways around a lot of these controls, and they're not going to stop everything. However, the first thing we want to stop is the general spraying and kinds of attacks that happen all the time on the internet. And I think that some of those non-focused ones are going to get blocked by some of the controls, so having secure configurations, things like that. And then the other thing is that I agree that if you're going to get into these machines and get around these controls, we want to make it so that the controls are somehow making that very noisy so that we can see it. So we're going to need our teams, our security teams, to be able to quickly identify this kind of behavior. And that's where some advanced solutions might be useful. John mentioned the Javelin, and then I listened to you guys talk about that a while ago, and I think that's a really awesome solution. And some of the user behavior analytics are promising. I don't know how they'll actually play out, but I think they're promising just to let us know that something weird's happening on Brian's computer. He doesn't normally do all these things, and we find out that there's an attacker doing something that Brian doesn't normally do, like go find all the people that are in the domain admin group. That's a problem with Active Directory, where you can gather this information as long as you're in the domain, and sometimes when you're not in the domain, if there aren't some of the secure configurations. And I did just experience a penetration test where that's how they got in, is the Active Directory allowed null connections, so they could easily get all the information from Active Directory. And when we talked to the security team, they said, oh no, we have a GPO for that. And then they found out that their GPO had an exclusion in it that excluded all the Active Directory servers. So it wasn't doing us any good. And it was specific to the Active Directory servers. So it was a policy that said Active Directory servers will have all these settings, and then they were excluded from their own settings.
Yeah, the configuration is also tricky because in that example, Brian, you have to make sure it's hitting all of your systems in the same way. Otherwise, one small exposure like that just exposes the whole network. So, Ted, thoughts on secure configuration and its effectiveness?
Not a lot. I was just thinking, though, about something I read recently, and you could say this is Control 5, but just default passwords all over the place. And it's, those are pretty common, at least I would think they'd never be found, but they're pretty common, and that's kind of a configuration thing. I think that you're not going to stop everybody, but you can do some of those basic things, and as has been mentioned, you can make it harder, and that's important.
I do want to say it's kind of interesting if you look at containers. You have to be so specific about your configuration for that application. I actually think that is going to help in secure configurations because you're forced to basically define that before the container is created. And I think I've used that certainly as an opportunity to say, well, what's the most secure configuration while I'm, making the transition into something that lives inside of a container. So, and I like the technology from Tenable that's helping people do that. I still think it is yet to become widespread adoption of containers for a number of reasons. Kubernetes probably being one of them, but I do think we're going to see more adoption as time goes on. So, and hopefully more security.
I'd like to drop a comment on that actually, Paul. Mm-hmm. I think both operating system, sort of step one there was operating system virtualization, and then we've gone into application level containerization with the Docker and other technologies. And I think that's actually huge because it's not just about the secure deployment and containerization of the app as it stands. It's also about agility in patching and remediation, which is a big deal. Because if you can quickly, proactively patch and remediate, you're going to go a long distance.
Yeah, and there's some interesting things. There's a lot of dependencies that get removed because you can split out your applications into multiple different containers, right? So that means you can update, for example, your web server independent of your app server, independent of your app, which is nice. However, that introduces a lot more complexity into the entire scheme as well. But I think once the tools mature a little more, we'll be able to get a handle on that complexity. And I think it'd be in much better shape. So, Brian and Ted, closing thoughts on the top 5 controls and resources where people can go read and learn more.
Ted, do you have anything?
Well, yeah, we have a lot of resources on our website. We've done, as I mentioned already, 3 detailed webcasts with Brian. We have 2 more scheduled. We have some videos with Catherine Burns from the Center for Internet Security. So lots of information there. One last thought is that I think that the controls have value beyond security into reducing IT costs just for the standardization side of the first 2 controls. And I think that the IT professionals need to be able to describe that value to the corporation because you need to have the tone at the top, particularly when you're getting into a situation where you say only authorized devices are going to connect to our network, only authorized software is going to be on our network. That's got to be top down, and if not, you're just not going to be successful with it.
Brian?
And I'll agree with all that. There's a number of resources out there. There's of course the SANS courses on the controls, and we're finishing up those webinars on the first 5 controls. So those are very well attended and a really good resource. I also am always open for people to have conversations about it because I do want to really understand what's the best that we should be doing inside of these controls.
Fantastic. Brian and Ted, thank you very much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you,
Paul.
With that, we're going to take a short break, come back, and talk about the enterprise security news for the week. Stay tuned.